This is the Overton Pod. Hello, Kanthan.
Good morning, John.
How are you?
I'm not carrying a pager, so I'm actually pretty fabulous. How about you?
I come from a middle-class family, so as Kamala Harris would say. So that's how you now should just start off all your sentences. Any question you get asked. I come from a middle-class family. I was raised middle-class. That's how you answer all questions. And then never actually get to the actual answer. That's what I'm going to be following for the rest of the year.
I was not raised middle class. My family was essentially poor but highly educated, and I think that's a win over middle class drudgery. What do you think?
It would be if she came from that background. I guess that would be shoved in our faces all the time.
The mysterious thing is that she has posted this picture of herself purportedly with her paternal grandmother. Mm-hmm. And now the records show that at the time that the picture was taken, her paternal grandmother was already long dead for a number of years. So
oh, really?
Really fascinating thing.
She's a very good liar.
So maybe she's part of your tribe because your tribe does resurrection, right?
No, not actually. Not unless there's some sort of messianic event, apparently. Not that big into that side of things. But a lot of things in the news, Kanthan. The so-called news. At this point, really, can we call it the news? Or is it just essentially a sort of open, conscious stream of propaganda from whoever the editors are from any particular sections of society and publications?
We don't really want to talk about them, do we? It's like kicking a person when they're down, and they certainly are down. I think we've probably got a situation where News 24 has lost several thousand subscribers over the past 24 hours. And, far be it from me to want to undermine media in a free and democratic society. But
that's great.
I do have a sense of schadenfreude here.
Yeah, but so just briefly, obviously after weeks of nonsense reporting on Ramon Cabernac, we then progressed into a little bit more of needling of Ronaldo Gous, and then as he took his exit from the DA, and then we now are going after Jan Braai, who basically just goes around the country and makes good boerie rolls and gives them to people. So two journalists, it didn't take one, Kanthan, it took two journalists, very sharp, very investigative, decided that because they saw a video in which he gave a few white people a boerie roll and not a black guy, he must be a racist. Even though the guy's been around for probably more than a decade at this point, does this stuff all the time. There's never been any idea that he is anything but a stand-up guy. And they spread that fake news, and as you mentioned, lost a whole bunch of subscribers as a result because it turned out to be bullshit. If the clever journalists,
let's call it for what it is. It's not fake news; it's deliberate race baiting.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
We've had this sustained campaign going in our country for a while now, where the media goes out of their way
to find white racists
to amplify any hint of the possibility that people are being racist, and they fundamentally are unable to come across any real incidents, and that's the reason why they have to pump up the stuff. It's because they can't find any real incidents.
Yes, so the demand for racism, not by anyone in general society, but really by the media, far exceeds the supply.
Exactly.
And so it's so interesting that the way the left comes across economics is in this fashion. And they then find every other, as you mentioned, hint of racism and amplify it, or they just find things that aren't racist in the least and then amplify it. But it is starting to backfire, and I think credibility-wise, which we've discussed repeatedly.
Look, frankly, I think we're at the stage as a nation right now where we are completely raced out, and we are raced out in the sense that we're fully aware of the fact that this is a narrative that has been drummed on for the past 30 years. And every single failure on the part of our various governments throughout this country to actually do the basics of delivering to the public, their defense has always been racism. Well, at some point, you've actually got to recognize that that's going to wear thin. You can only beat that particular drum for so long.
Especially when it gets shown to be untrue. You know, if we were living in somewhere where those things were absolutely factual, a part of, let's say, the law. Let's say you had law that said one race can get a job over another race just for being that race, for example. Then maybe if you reported on those kinds of things, that would be fine because it's legislated, right?
Exactly.
But
there are no laws being broken. It's just perceptions.
yeah, and feelings, of course. I think important to say is just to point out that the editor of News 24, Adrian Basson, before he became the editor, as a journalist, falsely reported on school kids who he claimed were doing Hail Hitler salutes. And all they were doing was singing a song. And in that song, there was a motion during the song where hands were lifted up into the sky. And he, of course, purposefully misinterpreted that, then printed it and maligned a whole bunch of school children. Was still escalated to the point of being the editor. And so these things are not isolated incidents. They're a long time coming. And the media fall that is occurring. News 24, Media 24 is essentially bankrupt. They can't make money. Daily Maverick is restructuring, have had to get rid of their terrible editor who doesn't know what right of reply is, and they are trying to save failing businesses. And then I see this week they proposed that, in fact, what should occur is the government should legislate so that they can be bailed out.
Well, they actually tried that a few years ago, and a lot of this ties into lawsuits that were popping up, primarily in places, well, like Australia as an example, to a lesser extent in the US, where people were saying Facebook and Google need to be paying the media houses because of the fact that their search engines, or the fact that they are posting information on those particular websites. Mm-hmm. And it's not a question of those tech giants actually republishing stuff themselves. All they're doing is publishing links to it.
That's right.
And for some reason, people expect that instead of being grateful for the traffic that's being driven to their sites, they're trying to extort money out of the process.
That's correct. And I'll point out what's more is that if you were to search for an article, let's say Overton Press published an article and News 24 published an article, Google would rank News 24 far higher than Overton Press. We might not even make the first page.
Yes, and in fact, I think what we should do is sue Google for the fact that it is amplifying fake news.
So, in fact, the legislation should be that media that's small and up and coming, in fact, should be given a step up by the government, and the big media will.
I never thought I'd see you as a proponent of
so
affirmative action.
I just need to say that I'm being very flippant there because I don't believe that any business which needs government handouts to survive deserves to survive, and that's just as simple as that. If your business, if your model works, then the market will buy into your product, and you will be successful. And it's as simple as that. And sometimes your product was successful, your model was successful, and things change. And, people don't necessarily see value there anymore. So they withdraw. Tupperware went bankrupt or filed for bankruptcy in the US. It's a little bit different there. But the point is that...
Well, they used to have these things called Tupperware parties.
They did.
And then P. Diddy took over.
What, with the 700 dildos?
Exactly.
Is that the Tupperware you're referring to?
Well, yes.
Right. So there is... Okay, so let's get off this because there's a lot to talk about as you bring up P. Diddy. I don't really want to... I don't know. Do you want to get into that topic specifically?
No, not at all.
Not at the moment. I want to wait for more stuff to come out.
We can talk about it when he suddenly commits suicide.
I think when he suddenly commits suicide, and I think we can talk about it when the FBI lose the tapes of all the people in Hollywood and the music industry who are undoubtedly on camera having sex with minors, most likely, and certainly having sex with each other that they wouldn't like to be put out there.
Yeah, it's so much less complicated in Russia. There you would simply fall out of a window.
Yes. Well, this way they've got to.
Of course, if he was in Gaza, they'd simply page him.
Right. So let's talk about the pages, Kanthan. I can feel you want to get there. I can feel it's a burning issue in the seat of your pants. Tell me what your thoughts are. So a quick summary for those who haven't necessarily been paying attention to the news in that regard. So you've got... Last week, a whole bunch of Hezbollah. Hezbollah, by the way, for the people at the Sunday Times, is not based in Gaza. In fact, Hamas and Hezbollah are not the best of friends. But Hezbollah is a terrorist group as recognized by the European Union, the United States, etc. And they are based in Syria. And, Lebanon.
In Lebanon.
They are based in Lebanon. And so, but it's well known that they're funded by Iran in part. And they obviously hate Israel, and they sit on the border of Lebanon and Israel. And they, for example, a month ago fired a few rockets into Israel, one of which hit a football field and killed
why do we
12
call
children.
these things rockets? I mean, they're basically missiles, aren't they?
Yeah, missile rockets,
But
whatever.
rocket makes it feel like it's a Guy Fawkes or Diwali celebration where you set off these things in your backyard and they go whizzing
past you.
Whizzing
and they
past
couldn't
you.
possibly hurt anyone.
And they couldn't possibly hurt
I
anyone.
mean, maybe a finger or two to the emergency department.
Let's be very clear. These things are missiles. They carry explosives, and they're designed to kill people.
And they did, and they do. And so... Israel's got this weird thing where down south they obviously have Hamas firing missiles into civilian territory. And up north on the border of Lebanon, where they also have the same phenomena with Hezbollah. Now, last week, before last week, maybe we should go back a couple of weeks. A couple of weeks ago, the sort of deputy head of Hezbollah was assassinated by Israel. And they took credit for it. And the way that they said he was sort of got, and the way the Hezbollah said he was got as well, was that the Israelis had been tracking his cell phone, and they'd been using cell towers, etc., to triangulate his position, and so they were able to know where he was to have a sort of targeted attack. And he died. And so they immediately moved away from cell phones because they felt like, the Israelis are tracking us, which they probably were. And they then told everyone to revert to main communication should run through pages that they have been using for quite some time. And last week, Israel did something to those pages that made, I've read different numbers, but around 3,000 pages simultaneously detonate. And the charges seem to be small enough that if you had the pager on your person, they would significantly hurt you, if not kill you. But they wouldn't hurt anyone around them. There's a video that's gone around social media where there's a guy in a grocery shop, in a fruit and veg store, and his pager detonates, and you see sort of the explosion and him drop to the ground, but there's people around him within 1 meter, 2 meters, and they're all fine. So that happened. So given that background, I'll let you get into your sort of take on all of this.
Well, my take on all of this is it's kind of like just pretend that we are spectators and, we kind of at a distance and we can see a train crash about to happen. Okay, now none of us wants a train crash. Okay, but you are at the stage where there's no way that you can stop the train crash from happening. No matter how loudly you shout, you're not going to be able to get the train driver to slow down. And so at that point, what you do is you sit back and say, all right, let's take a look at the physics of this thing. Let's see how it actually plays itself out.
Okay.
What is the possible fallout? What is the possible collateral damage? Where are we likely to find the various pieces of wreckage ending up? Is it going to concertina when it derails, or is it going to just simply roll over and down an embankment?
Yeah, what are the options? Could we maybe get hold of someone at the back of the train, and could they decouple a couple of carts, and so those ones wouldn't go over the edge?
Yes, exactly that type of thing.
Things.
Now, so my take now in terms of the conflicts playing themselves out in the Middle East is very similar to that, because no matter how much I shout and scream, I have no way of affecting the outcome. So all I can do is kind of sit back and take this very analytical view on what's actually going on. And I look at this, and the thought that came to mind for me was like, wow. and the reason why it's wow is the level of planning that needed to be in place
Yes.
on the part of the Israelis in order
And
to
deception. I mean, the deception that occurred.
planning, deception. I mean, this is Sun Tzu level of planning, and for people who don't know Sun Tzu, he wrote a book called The Art of War a few thousand years ago.
Yeah.
Recommended reading. You'll find downloadable copies anywhere on the internet, and it goes into great detail on knowing the enemy's territory, the use of spies. It's fascinating,
And also when to be smart, when not to just be
And when- yeah.
attacking or
Yes.
reactive, when to be passive on purpose so that you can win the attacking war later.
Yes.
Those types of things.
Yeah, and there's another very similar story that comes to mind, which is the story of the Trojan horse, which we might remember was a gift being sent across
Yeah.
in the form of a horse, and the horse happened to be filled with soldiers.
Yep.
And the point at which they were once firmly inside the territory, they then proceeded to attack, and the rest, as we say, is history. And the level of planning that the Israelis put into, firstly, anticipating that there was going to be a demand for pages, secondly, investing in companies that were going to be producing these pages. And this is stuff that was done years in advance.
And also driving Hezbollah to use the pages so religiously, making it their primary form of communication. Israel doesn't tend to announce the way they do things. So when they turn around and go, we tracked this guy using his cell phone, they knew that would be a trigger for Hezbollah to somewhat abandon their cell phone use and to default to their next communication tool, which was their pages having now been sabotaged in what is not yet clear a process, but it appears as if, so they didn't, originally it was thought that they might have overloaded the batteries, software, and you get the batteries to sort of combust essentially from increased draw.
No, but now it's very clear that those pages were in fact specifically constructed.
Yes, that's right.
For the purpose of being explosive device.
That's right. With some sort of explosive type of device, or with the batteries rigged to become an explosive device more than they could be in any other device. So there was a lot of like, oh no, well, we're now all carrying bombs in our pockets because we have phones type of thing. That's not your phone could be a bomb because any lithium-ion battery can detonate, but usually not quite as spectacularly as these pages did. So there was a definite setup of that, but they drove them to that, and even more so, the planning that the next day, when they all had now abandoned their pages, they then went to walkie-talkies, and some of their other electronics had also been sabotaged and then detonated. Just an incredible level of sort of planning and thinking that went into this. And, well, someone recently on social media, I thought it was a very clever comment, said if Israel wanted to go to war with Hezbollah, they should start one now, because 3,000 of their top guys, because you didn't have a pager unless you were sort of inner circle, so to speak. 3,000 of their top guys are either injured or dead. So not a bad time to now pick the bigger fight.
But you see, you've actually identified the core problem out here, because how does one start a fight with an enemy where one cannot identify the enemy? And that's really the core issue around guerrilla warfare versus conventional warfare, and which has always been the case in terms of what goes down in terms of the Gaza conflict, because you have no effective way of saying who is actually a
Combatant.
a Hamas combatant and who is a civilian.
Yeah.
Because of the fact that
They wear the same clothing.
they wear the same clothing, and it just so happened that they found a convenient way based on their pages to be able to pinpoint exactly who these people are. But we have to be very clear that it can't be a question of declaring war on Lebanon, because take the view that up until the time that I was a kid growing up, Lebanon used to be a majority Christian country. And
I think 70 to 80%, something like that.
Absolutely. And it was just the point at which Lebanon ended up being a Muslim majority country was when demographics just basically overtook them. because
Yeah.
of the fact that the TFR of the Muslims who arrived in Lebanon, and let's be very clear, they were migrants that were let into Lebanon.
And look, I think
Mm.
important to note that there is a sort of, I don't know if you'd call it loose, certainly fragile peace agreement between Israel and Lebanon. So if Israel were to sort of full scale go into Lebanon, then that could cause a bigger problem with the Lebanese government, because actually there's what's going on in Lebanon with regards to Hezbollah is very different to Hamas and Gaza.
Absolutely.
Because what you have in Lebanon is that the Lebanese government is not fully supportive of Hezbollah. They actually see them as a bit of a thorn in their side. It's difficult because of the geopolitics. It's difficult for them to sort of expunge them, because they've got a relationship with Iran, for example. There are people in the government there who are supportive, but it's not wholly supportive. So, and most importantly, is that the population of Lebanon is not supportive of Hezbollah. The majority of the population, actually more than 50%, is not supportive.
Which is a very different scenario to what we have in Gaza.
And in Gaza, you have 90 to 98% of the population supports Hamas.
And to go further, one could make a case that in Gaza, one could argue that the people of Gaza are, to some extent, wanting to reclaim territory that they think that they have claim to. Hezbollah has no such logistics. Hezbollah's role is not in any way to claim ancestral land in what is today Israel. It is there entirely as an antagonistic organization with the objective of destroying the state of Israel. So it's a very different business model.
The mythology, I suppose, is a lot more difficult to sell, because Hezbollah is saying, we just want to irritate this other country here because we don't like them. Whereas the sell in Gaza will obviously be, we want to get rid of this other country because they stole from us.
Exactly, yes. So it's a very different narrative.
Yeah.
And also fundamentally, I've made this point here previously, contrary to what people might believe, Hamas is not looked upon favorably by the Iranians, but Hezbollah very definitely is. And they are actively funded by the Iranians. And again, it's a very crucial difference.
Yeah, so on the population support side, it's also making things a bit easier for the Israelis. There were a whole bunch of strikes that took place over the last few days in which Israelis had mapped out villages, and Hezbollah had hidden missiles inside houses. So, garages of houses, and then they'll just pull the missile out on a wheel-based system, and they'll pull the missile out and then be able to fire it. But it's in the middle of a village, so you can't just bomb the village, because you'll kill a whole bunch of civilians. There'll be a lot of collateral damage. And
well, I saw this video of a particular strike on an apartment block in Lebanon, and it was so obviously a very tall, multi-story block. But the Israeli strike took out a very specific apartment, and then you sit and watch this explosion, and then suddenly there's a whole range of secondary explosions that start kicking in from all of the surrounding places.
Sure.
Clearly ammunition exploding.
That goes off. But what's helping is obviously that the population is not as hostile to Israel. So the intelligence gathering is a lot more easy for the Israelis. And so they can actually get information. So, Israeli intelligence inside Lebanon will be able to ask Lebanese people, where are Hezbollah storing missiles or weapons? And often Lebanese people will help them because they're not pro-Hezbollah and they actually want Hezbollah out of their villages. Different story to Hamas and Gaza, where if you have so much support for Hamas, it's very unlikely you ask a Palestinian, where is Hamas storing their missiles and ammunitions, that it's very unlikely you're going to get a straight answer there or help, certainly, from that. Okay, so that's just fascinating, I think. And I think it's also fascinating given October 7th, because that was such an intelligence failure on the part. It wasn't just an intelligence failure. We've never actually discussed it deeply on the podcast. But suffice to say,
I think it was an intelligence failure in the sense that Netanyahu has been so focused on Hezbollah for the longest time that he was completely blindsided and not paying attention.
He also wrongfully believed that Hamas could be kind of held in place. That's been reported in my opinion, unfairly by places like the New York Times. You can go find articles about how Netanyahu funded Hamas. That's not actually what occurred. The Israelis gave money to the government there, which is technically Hamas, so that when you say he funded Hamas, I suppose that statement is correct. They funded it. They try to ring fence money for specific projects, education, water, sanitation, those types of things. But there definitely was a thinking within Israeli intelligence that Hamas could be subdued and could be kind of kept within their borders. They'd always hate Israel. They'd always say negative things. They'd fire rockets every couple of weeks into Israel. You would always have this conflict, but it would be low level. But what really happened is not only a intelligence failure in that regard, but what really happened was a military and a technology failure. I'm always interested. We've had this discussion about how war is going to change, but what happened in Israel is that they had already decided war was going to change, and so they de-escalated their over a decade. Essentially, they de-escalated their protections on the Israel-Gaza border, and they actually increased the amount of technology being used. So they had a lot of, for example, they had guard towers, which they converted from human guard towers into digital guard towers. And then, their logic being, well, you don't need people there, so that's great. You save the people, you save the money in terms of that, you save the resources, and those people don't need to be anywhere near danger. And so you have these guard towers. The problem is when your enemy figures out that you have those guard towers and those guard towers don't have guns, or even if they do have some sort of automated weaponry, if you fly a drone directly above them and drop a grenade straight down, that you immediately sort of neutralize that. And if that guard tower is protecting a military base and you used to put 400 people at that military base, and over the years you've sort of gone, well, there's no real threat here, we'll put 40 people there, and suddenly 400 people rock up from the other side with guns firing, and you've neutralized your automated guns, 40 people versus 400 becomes a bit of a tall order. So that was kind of what happened on the 7th of October. But what I think is so interesting is that, it was a huge embarrassment, to say the least, about the 7th for Mossad and for the Israeli military. And this pager thing just really has almost given them a few more points to raise their stature, for want of better terminology.
Yeah, I think that there are people who are always going to be disdainful of Mossad for ideological reasons, and there are people who are always going to be singing the praises of Mossad for ideological reasons. My perspective on it is that I respect the technology, man. I really respect the technology.
100%. No, yeah, I think there's fair criticism to be made of intelligence agencies. They do dodgy stuff.
Yeah,
all of them. Mossad, CIA. FSB now, former KGB, it doesn't matter which side you're on. In general, they're not there to be nice guys. They're not there to be moral guys either. So criticisms aside, all I'm saying is it was an impressive operation that they ran. And as you say, you just love the technology.
Yeah.
You think this changes warfare a bit? Because you're big on that.
We haven't even scratched the surface yet on the extent to which warfare has been changed, and ultimately warfare is going to be determined by capacity for industrial level production. So you have to take technology like Optimus, which is Elon Musk's robot.
Yeah.
So you already have the ability for robots to be able to perform warfare.
Yeah.
And so what is going to determine the course of war is the extent to which you are able to ramp up on production at scale. And right now, the West is losing that particular war because they cannot keep up with production at the same levels as the Russian and Chinese are able to. So on the one side, you've got very definitely the more advanced tech. On the other side, you've got the capacity to produce, let's say, tech that's not of the same standard, but at such higher numbers that it ends up completely swamping whatever tech is on the other side. And I made this point previously in terms of the Iron Dome. The Iron Dome is a fabulous piece of tech, but when you're able to swarm the Iron Dome with thousands upon thousands of drones.
Or airborne projectiles.
Whatever
they are.
Yeah, you end up winning it just simply based on overwhelming the opposition with numbers, not with superior technology. So I don't know where this is going. I don't think this is a game changer in terms of what's happening in the entire Israel/Middle East solution. And ultimately, this is going to have to be a political solution that ends up getting carved out. But that's not going to happen under the current Biden administration.
No.
And it's certainly not going to happen if Kamala Harris ends up being the next president of the United States.
Okay, so let's pivot to that, because they try to kill Trump again, which is just, it's astonishing, because a few months ago we discussed the first Trump assassination attempt, which was very nearly successful. And it was a big thing. It really was a big thing. First American president to be shot at in almost 40 years, I think it is. First sort of credible threat against an American president in that time as well. You've sort of had multiple presidents over the time where there really have been no real honest attempts. I mean, there was the shoe at George Bush's head. That was about as close as you get to any kind of violence against an American president. It almost felt as if we'd moved past that, in the West at least. There's still political assassinations that happen almost everywhere else, but it felt as if, at least as far as the leaders are concerned, we'd moved past it. So, that attempt on Trump felt like a big thing, and now it feels like it's becoming mundane. It's like, we're going to talk about the second attempt. Will we talk about a third attempt? How many times can they be unsuccessful? It's very obvious that the most charitable interpretation is that individual people who don't like Trump are definitely trying to kill him. And there must be more than two of those in the United States.
I'd certainly differentiate between the first and the second attempt.
Okay.
And the reason why I'd differentiate between those two, the second attempt was, if you follow the social media track record of the guy who was planning the second attempt.
You mean the guy who was interviewed by Washington Post and other high entities?
Absolutely. So he's essentially a career clickbaiter, shall we say.
He's an activist, though.
Yeah, but who has very strong feelings about Ukraine, volunteered and went across there for a while, clearly supports that cause, clearly disapproves of the fact that Trump has made it clear that he's going to shut down that war, as well as other wars that are happening in other parts of the world. Pitches up with an AK-47, not an assassin's rifle. I mean, can we...
I just need to make a correction. So it wasn't an AK-47.
It was not.
It was a type of almost replica produced by another company, American company, and that gun is sort of more accurate than an AK-47. It doesn't go to full auto because that would be illegal.
But it's not a sniper's rifle, is my point that I'm trying to make.
So they've adjusted it. So it's a 7.62 round, but it actually is a gun that can be used for hunting long distance. So it can be used as a sniper's rifle. So I'm going to kind of push back a little bit against you there.
But what I'm trying to say is that the level of sophistication, when one compares the first attempt versus the second attempt. So
this guy actually had a scope. The first one, you corrected me on the first one. The first one just used iron sights.
Yes.
The second one, he had an actual scope, and he had body armor, essentially clay plates, which usually is what you put into, you can put into a bulletproof vest. He had that, which he had sort of cable tied or something like that to the chain link fence at the edge of the golf course, so that when Secret Service assumptively started shooting back, he would hopefully not be shot and would be able to get away. And he had a whole bunch of plans to get away and all the rest of it. I don't know that I'm convinced of this. I'm not convinced the second guy was as rudimentary as you feel.
So I'm making a case that there's a very different mindset that kicks in between the first and second assassination attempts.
Yeah.
The first assassination attempts, we discussed all of the red flags that were present there in terms of the quality of Secret Service operatives that were on the ground at the time, the very deliberate oversights in terms of security protocols, all of that kind of stuff. In this particular case, none of those things were in place. So there very clearly was some intelligence lapses in terms of his knowing at what point he needed to be at that particular section of the golf course.
At a location where Trump wasn't scheduled to be.
Sure.
He made that decision on the day.
Yes.
To go golfing there specifically.
But let's be very clear as well that in this particular case, it was the Secret Service that actually identified the threat.
Yes.
And protected Trump. So again, it's a very different scenario to what happened the first time.
I'm going to go with the uncharitable view. So I've said what the charitable view is. You can call it conspiracy, non-conspiracy, whatever. But I feel that both events have a lot of questions which raise the potential that there may have been help, and this wasn't a lone gunman. In the second case, we've been over the first case, so I won't rehash, but in the second case, this is a guy who lives in Hawaii, doesn't earn very much money. He earns about $3,000 a month. He somehow manages to fund trips to Ukraine and back, including to meet President Zelensky. He somehow manages to be in Florida.
Well, former President Zelensky, because his term elapsed in May, and he's actually
dictator Zelensky.
Yeah, he's actually an illegitimate president because he did not call elections.
You heard it first on the Overton pod, guys. Fair enough. He's exhausted his term, so he should no longer be the president, and he's probably violating some sort of constitutional order in the Ukraine.
Absolutely, and I just want to point out that in the middle of the war, Russia did hold elections.
So probably not legitimate elections, though, but elections.
Oh, no, they were certainly legitimate. And, all of the other candidates, who happened to
just
fall out of windows.
To throw themselves out of windows. Yeah. So, this guy now manages to get to Florida, and he also has a gun that costs apparently more than $3,000. And, all of these things sort of add up together to say, well, how did this come about? Sure, maybe he could have made it work or put it together himself. But at minimum, he had to have someone else, in my opinion, giving him money. So that's a conspiracy to murder, even if you, don't... it would be very hard to extricate yourself from
There's a lot of cash floating around in Ukraine, He went to visit Zelensky, and there was a suitcase there.
Sure.
And he picked it up.
And his cell phone puts him on the, on the fence 12 hours before, and the Secret Service has not been given the resources to protect Donald Trump at the same level as Kamala Harris or Joe Biden. So there's no perimeter security, like 24-hour perimeter security on Trump. There's just too much there for me. And it's concerning. That said, if they do off Trump, then the remaining ticket is now J.D. Vance, who will win in an absolute landslide under those conditions. And I don't.
Are you saying you don't trust the polls that are showing that Kamala Harris is now ahead?
Cool. So let's get into that then, because I think that's important. So there's been some talk about this. You can't trust the polls. Now even South Africans love to trust polls. We had some polling around our election, and the people who got it right spent about 4 weeks just masturbating online about how they got it right. And people love polling, and they want to believe the polling. Fortune tellers with regards to elections. So, don't trust those guys in caravans on the side of the road, but polling, 100%, it's a science, guys. So why might the polling, which currently says that Kamala Harris is going to win, currently says certainly she's going to win the popular vote. The Electoral College will be tight, but most polling would say that she's winning it, or it's too hard to call. Says Pennsylvania is even split currently, which either of them need to win to become the president. Why might that be wrong?
I don't think it's really wrong. I think polls, by and large, are a good reflection at the time. But the important thing to remember about polls is that they are not truly indicative of what people are going to do on the actual election day.
Yeah,
which is a very crucial differentiator. So there's a couple of trends that I see happening right now. The one is that I can see a larger than one would anticipate turnout on the part of young first-time voters in favor of Kamala Harris. And that just simply happens to be because of the fact that the particular social media platforms that they tend to play on, Instagram being
TikTok as well.
Yeah, and TikTok as well. And those are platforms that overwhelmingly have been tilted in favor of the Harris ticket. So at the same time, you have a scenario, and Trump himself has pointed this out. He says that people keep making out the case that I'm pandering to the Bible Belt and to the NRA. He said, the big problem that I have is that even though the people in the Bible Belt and the NRA support me, they don't generally go to the polls and vote. And in fact, if all of them simply went to the polls and voted,
yeah, you'd win easily.
Yeah, so those are very real dynamics that that kick in. And you look in terms of this scenario that we had in our last elections, where there was an overall reduction in the number of people who actually went to the polls to vote. Again, that's because of the fact that on election day itself, no matter who you support, are you going to get out of bed and go schlep across to the polls and cast your vote, or are you just going to take a day off and stay at home? So I don't think that we should read too much into the polls as a predictor of outcome right now. But certainly the trends that we can pick up is that you had a blip that Harris got at the time of the debate. And,
it was small, though. It was 0.5%.
It doesn't matter. But there was a blip, and the blip comes from the fact that her performance in the debate, if you look at it just entirely objectively, if you were watching a school debating championship, you would say that her performance was on point. Now, we know in hindsight that the reason why her performance was that good is because she had access to the questions beforehand and very carefully rehearsed her answers. And she was not fact-checked in real time. Well, Trump was fact-checked in real time because a lot of what she said were just outright lies.
Correct.
Okay, and she was not fact-checked on it. But the interesting thing, just to finish this point, in terms of the polls, is that, so she had a blip at the time, but again, people's memories on that are short. And then everything that she said subsequently has certainly not been able to carry momentum. So she's had a downgrade in the polls since the debate.
Okay,
and I think that's going to be the pattern.
So as you know, the US politics is where I spend most of my focus and attention as far as politics is concerned. And because South African politics is, I spend some time on it, but it's very easy to read. It's very obvious. And yeah, so the American side, so here's my disagreement. Firstly, for those who aren't in the know, there's an affidavit that has been written by a whistleblower stating that ABC colluded with the Kamala Harris campaign to give her the questions to guarantee her that she wouldn't be fact-checked, etc. That has not yet been verified. So I just need to point that out. It's unclear whether that's someone looking for attention. We don't know the name of the whistleblower, for example. We don't know their position. We don't know if they had access. They claim there are tapes of them of some of these discussions between the campaign and the network. So that's what Kanthan's referring to. So just firstly on how her performance was, how his performance was. I think it's very, very difficult to go into debate into any arena where you have 3 against 1. Yes. So Trump would have looked worse than he would have been expected to look. The expectations on Trump in a debate are high because he generally does quite well. The expectations on her were very low because she's Kamala Harris, who before the media, before July, August, had a 30% approval rating, was widely mocked across all media networks, including the left-wing and Democrat-supporting ones. But I repeat myself. And so she's not a particularly liked person. She's not a particularly well thought of person. But so what happened was she rocks up to debate and performs better than expected. But the bar for her is so low that I don't think that either of that affects voting. Okay, because people look at the Trump performance and go, 3-on-1, he had a bad night. Okay? I'm talking about independents. I'm not talking about set in their ways MAGA supporters, set in their ways Dem supporters. The independents go, Trump had a bad night, but he had 3-on-1. He got fact-check sheeted, and the independents will see obvious stuff like that. Kamala comes up and she does well, but they're not going she does well. They're going she did well for her. They still haven't forgotten who she is as a person, what her policies are, the things she said before, that she's never explained why, allegedly, according to a staffer, she's now okay with fracking, but before she said she's absolutely going to ban it. So the people haven't kind of forgotten that, and so that's why I don't think there was really any hit on the polls in either way, for either of them, in fact. And I also note a couple of things that have happened since. So number one is that she's demanding a second debate. Trump agreed to a second debate with either Fox News or ABC. In fact, those dates were preset before the first debate between them happened. She refused to do either because she doesn't want to go to Fox, and for whatever reason, she doesn't want to go to ABC News, probably because they would be down the road, down the middle. When a candidate requests a debate, historically, maybe I'm wrong this time, but historically, candidates who request debates are losing. They are not in the ascendancy, and they are not winning. They need the debate to showcase themselves against their opponent. So her requesting a debate seems to indicate something is wrong with their internal
She
polling.
wants a debate on her terms, though.
Right, but even so, the reason why she would need a debate, if she's winning as per what the polling says, she doesn't need a debate. It's
Well,
too risky.
I'll say to you that she doesn't actually want a debate. She is pretending to want a debate, but she's wanting a debate on terms that would be absolutely impossible for Trump to accept, which then allows her to build a narrative that says something to the effect that Trump is scared.
She's going to lose on that narrative. So they tried that narrative before the first debate.
So
and lost.
You know, I made this earlier point to you just now that in technical terms, if one was looking at the first debate as a high school debate, then I would say that technically she came off better off. But now I'm also going to tell you that actually Trump won the first debate, and I'll tell you why.
Cats and dogs.
Cats and dogs. That's the only thing that people remember from that debate. Mm-hmm. Okay? They're eating the cats. They're eating the dogs.
And who's they?
Yeah.
The they is illegal immigrants.
Illegal immigrants. And that's the takeaway from that debate that has gone viral. And that's the only thing that people are now remembering around the world.
Yeah.
And, we mustn't underestimate Trump's ability to play that long game. The guy is a past master at doing that type of stuff.
Yeah. So
the crucial thing that I'm getting at, if right now there was a free and fair election in the United States, Trump would win hands down. Okay, the way in which the United States runs its election
is diabolical.
Is diabolical, and the very simple logic of you're not needing ID in a number of places to be able to pitch up and vote, which means that you can pretty much end up going in to vote multiple times and all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So
I agree with you on all of that. I think with regards to the polling, so there's that about the polling. I think there's a lot missed in the polling. Firstly, if you look at some of these polls, they weighted. So they poll more Democrats than they do Republicans, for example. So there's that. And there's a fair amount of disagreement. And if you look at Nate Silver's tracking, he tracks Donald Trump to win, and he has been for about 3 months now. And he was tracking Biden to win, by the way, before that. I would be wary. I'd be wary, but I'd also say that it's hard to predict what goes on in the United States because they have all of this weird stuff with their voting, mail-in ballots, for example, drop boxes, all that stuff in some states. And those states happen to very often be the swing states. And so it's unclear. But what I did want to talk to you about, linking back to South Africa, was it the Financial Times that put out an article claiming that South Africans are kind of bringing white supremacy
Yes,
Sorry, I'm just actually looking up this article. You sent it to me on WhatsApp, and I just want to open it up. But yeah, so the Financial Times wrote a whole article about how there are these. So the heading is Musk, Thiel, and the Shadow of Apartheid, South Africa. Right, and I don't pay for tabloid journalism, so I haven't got through the paywall. But I know what the argument is because they've made this online in open spaces before, and others have too. Elon Musk is South African. Peter Thiel has South African sort of links. You've got a couple of the venture capital guys. The one guy from the All In Pod.
David Sachs is South African born as well.
South African born
yeah, but
guy.
I understand that the reason why these people left the country in the first place is because they disliked apartheid.
Yeah.
Okay.
Or the national government. I mean, Elon Musk didn't want to serve in the military.
Exactly. And, so he ended up leaving. And in David Sachs's case, I mean, like, he was 5 years old when his parents ended up migrating to the United States.
but so let's steel man their argument for a second, as ridiculous as it is. Basically, they're saying, look, you've got a whole bunch of white South Africans who've done very well for themselves, the likes of Elon Musk and Sachs and others, who are now overtly supporting Trump. And of course, Trump is Hitler and, white supremacists and all this rubbish.
But again, let's take a look at that.
So these guys, obviously, they've imported South African white supremacy, is the argument. But
let's take a look at that very specifically, because up until, probably, in fact, less than 10 years ago, Musk was declared Democrat.
Yeah.
Okay, he was very clearly voting blue at the time. And, there was a consistent track record around that. Certainly all of the other guys that you're talking about from who are playing in the tech space and the venture capitalist space, one of the reasons why they've actually been turning around and now saying that they're going to vote for Trump is because the regulatory framework that has been put in place by the Democrats, and let's be very clear, the Democrats are essentially putting in a level of bureaucratic complexity that would make the Soviets envious. You are so hamstrung by all of these various regulatory hurdles. Musk, for example, has been trying to get Starship launched, and now he's got a further 2-month delay pending regulatory approval. As opposed to people saying the guy has done it before, he's got a track record, just let him go. Instead, they've got to call in inspectors and do all of that kind of stuff.
And hilariously, the people they're calling in as the inverted commas experts can't possibly be experts. They can't possibly regulate what Elon's doing because he's the only person who's ever done this.
Yes.
He's the only one doing it successfully, and all the people who know how to do it work for SpaceX. So the government's sending an inspector to check that his rocket works properly or that his spaceship is correct or whatever, can't possibly know that it's correct. I mean, they might know that it's correct on basis of
But you must understand that all of this that we're talking about is very sustained campaign on the part of the Biden administration and against the man very specifically. So again, if you look in terms of Starlink, okay, because there was a contract that was rolled out to provide rural connectivity, which they refused to give to Starlink in the first place because they said that it's not going to work.
Sorry, I just need to give everyone listening and watching the context of this. $44 billion. $44 billion. Just to make you understand, that's half of South African GDP. Okay? Half of South African GDP.
No, it's not half of South African
GDP. It is. We're 2 trillion rand, right?
No. That's South Africa's income revenue. No, our GDP is closer to 357 billion or around about there.
Dollars?
Dollars, yeah.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Well, frick.
But no,
okay, Kanthan, but it's 15% of our GDP.
Yeah, it's
15% of our GDP, and the deal was for $44 billion, they would roll out high-speed internet connectivity in rural America. Because what most people actually don't know about America is that, all of us have visited, if you've been lucky enough to, but if you've been lucky enough to go to the States, the places you go are New York, Boston, LA, Miami, you visit big cities, and you go to those big cities, and you could be in any big city in the world. You could be in downtown Cape Town, you could be in Paris, you could be in Moscow, you could be in any big city, right? The truth is that if you go into rural America, it's not much different to rural South Africa. In terms of the services that are available, healthcare, technology, these types of access to internet. So they have a deficit, believe it or not, in the United States of providing high-speed internet if you drive a few hundred miles from some of their major cities, especially in the Midwest. And so they fund this. $44 billion, I think, 3 years ago.
Yes.
And they've connected not one person to they cannot show one person.
And yet the money has been spent.
But the money's been spent. Mm-hmm. 44 billion has been spent. Not a single person has the internet.
So they refused to give 850 million to Starlink because they said Starlink is not going to work. Now that Starlink proves it's possible, the Federal Communications Commission is now going after Starlink because they say it's unfair, they have a monopoly.
It's unbelievable. Mm-hmm. Unbelievable.
Because we can't roll out fiber into these areas. So the interesting side effect around this, okay, is that if you track the way a lot of these conversations are currently going across various platforms, and I'm not pointing to X in particular, I'm just looking kind of across the board in terms of various Substacks, as an example, things that pop up on Unheard, various podcasts. And this entire idea of white supremacy being a bad thing.
Oi, Kanthan.
No. And this is stuff that we need to be taking, a very careful look at, okay? Because the overall impact of bludgeoning people over and over again and telling them that everything that came about in terms of Western civilization is as a result of white supremacy and therefore must be undermined.
Yes.
And people who are
labeling is the problem.
The labeling is the problem. And now, as a direct result of that, people are saying, well, if I'm going to be labeled as a white supremacist, maybe I actually do need to now be pushing for a white supremacist narrative at a number of levels. And it's an interesting subtext that been popping up at a number of levels.
Well, it's a dangerous subtext.
Of course, it's a danger because we have the historical
white
context.
Person did something.
Doesn't
make it white supremacy. It's just a white person doing
something. But the historical context, if we know that if we head down that particular path, tracks itself back to what had finally culminated 80 years ago with the liberation of Auschwitz.
Yeah.
It's scary stuff, and people are not actually recognizing that if you keep pushing a particular narrative for long enough, you'll take people who are otherwise reasonable and otherwise likely to compromise and push them into an environment where they are going to completely flip the switch. And I look in terms of what's been happening in our own country right now, where there are many people who, I would have considered generally reasonable and left of center as little as 5 years ago. And now they've been very firmly pushed onto the fringes based on the fact that they've been ostracized for no good reason whatsoever. I would, cite as an example Germ, who was basically bludgeoned multiple times. And now he... I still, I'm fond of the guy, but, frankly, some of the stuff that the rabbit holes that he now goes down are things that I think are like seriously cloud cuckoo land. But this is what happens when you refuse to allow people to actually coalesce around a center where there's room for reasonable discussion. And you just create a narrative that's so outrageous that it completely polarizes the society and creates these enclaves. And ultimately, the net result is that you have an overall fragmentation of that society. Meanwhile, people who relentlessly stamp down upon these discussions, and I use Russia, India, and China as examples, where they do control their social media quite relentlessly and stamp out these things as soon as they pop up. You just remember that India was one of the first places to ban TikTok. They actually end up being far more socially coherent, which means that their direct impact in terms of their economy and their countries end up being better off as a result. So yeah, it's destructive, and but it also makes you realize the extent to which the Western media as a whole all tie into the central narrative that is emerging from ultimately from Washington and its keepers.
But it's not a censorship. It's not an argument for censorship. Just so I'm
No, it isn't.
clear.
No, it isn't.
Because
but let's be very clear that this is an argument against control of the media by interests that are skewed in a very specific direction, which is not, calling for censorship. It is calling for transparency.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, again, getting back to our media and their now begging pot going to the government and requesting legislation to protect them from themselves is just, it's fascinating to me, because if our media just was reported in the interests of South Africa, I see the DA, for example, has Alan Winde at a climate conference in New York, even though and I'm almost certainly he flew business class, so his carbon footprint for that flight there and back is greater than the carbon footprint of most South Africans over probably a decade. So he can frankly get screwed lecturing anyone on the climate. But he's at a climate conference. We've got the DA's environmental minister. Everyone forgot that the DA got that little position, Dion George, who is pushing for the just energy transition, which is a nice way of saying making countries and underdeveloped countries poor and keeping them poor. He's all in on that. And if you had a media that was pro-South Africa and not foreign funded in a large part, they would actually be saying, what the heck is the DA doing? This is not going to help South Africans. This is going to set us back. And there's a place to really criticize the DA. But our media is unable to do that because they receive money from foreign entities. And those foreign entities are very much for the just energy transition. They're very much for climate fear-mongering. And as a result, there's no credibility again on those from those entities, because they won't criticize on things that should be criticized. Our politics moves ever more in that direction, which is not anything anyone voted for. I mean, that is absolute fact. Go look at the manifestos of the parties. No one was talking about just energy transitions and climate change and all the rest of that crap. They were focusing on things that matter to South Africans, because even if you think that those things are really important and they're your pet projects, they're just not the most important things for our country. But there's just no coalescence in terms of discussing these issues and making sure that we do what's best for South Africans.
Well, I had a very interesting red pill over the past week.
Yeah, tell me.
So we all know about the three biggest nuclear disasters in history. We know about 3 Mile Island. We know about Chernobyl and Fukushima. Okay. So here's my red pill. Okay. When did Chernobyl stop producing electricity?
About 20 years ago now. So 2003 or something.
The year 2000, yeah. Okay. When did 3 Mile Island stop producing electricity?
I think also something like 10 or 15 years ago.
2019, just 5 years ago.
5 years ago.
Just 5 years ago. Now, more to the point, what's happened is that...
And Fukushima?
I didn't follow up.
I'll tell you the answer. To my knowledge, Fukushima is no longer producing electricity, but all but one of the generation units at Fukushima is completely
restored.
Was never damaged,
right?
And in fact, could be used to produce electricity. The Japanese have just chosen not to. And it's a bit of a political hot potato in Japan.
Sure.
But the term disaster applied to any of these things is quite hilarious, in fact.
So the interesting thing for me right now is that if you look across the world over the past week, there's been a flurry of activity in favor of nuclear energy. Yeah. And what has really triggered this is that Microsoft has struck a deal to resurrect 3 Mile Island.
Yes, because it needs energy for AI.
And it needs energy for AI, and they've committed to a 20-year buyback of energy from 3 Mile Island in order to power their data centers. So there's suddenly been this wake-up call where people have realized that the race for the future is going to be, in terms of these data
Kanthan,
centers.
I just need to ask you, though. I mean, inquiring minds want to know.
Yes.
Surely they could just build a wind farm and a solar farm and then power their data centers, which suck more energy than an average city.
No, there's no way in hell they'd be able to do that. You and I know that. I've made the case previously that you can't run an aluminium smelter with
renewables.
With renewables. You can't.
Renewables,
yes. You cannot run a rail network across the entire country on renewables.
Yeah.
You just simply cannot do so.
Yeah.
So right now, the choices really, in our case, happen to be build more coal-fired power stations,
Sure.
which we should.
Because we've got lots of
because
coal
we
in the
got
ground.
lots of coal in the ground.
And it's cheap and it creates jobs.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but the interesting thing now is that you've suddenly got banks saying that they're going to be funding nuclear projects, which previously they were saying that they were not willing to do. India, by the way, has suddenly leapfrogged into the pebble bed modular reactor space. I'm just using that as a synonym for small nuclear power plants. But India has been rolling out these small power plants at very strategic locations around the country, again, with a view primarily to driving the tech economy. China is already the world leader in that particular sphere.
You know what I love about this Microsoft thing, though, is that it's not the government, right? It's not the government who's going to drive this, and unfortunately, it never really is. The seeping into politics of all these terrible ideas has often come from the private sector, in terms of, especially in the States where there's so much lobbying and funding. But what I do love is that the private sector is going to drive nuclear energy, because Microsoft now is saying, we don't trust the grid being provided by the government. We are going to go find reliable energy elsewhere. And we've looked at it. We don't have to pander to anyone because we're a private company. We only have to pander to our shareholders. And all they want is good returns. And so we've looked at it, and the facts are very simple.
Just full disclosure, I'm one of those shareholders.
So am I. Mm-hmm. So not a big one by any means. But the point is they've looked at it and said the most reliable form of energy, when you look at it without any of the politics involved, you just look at the facts, is nuclear energy. And so that's what we want. And I would be very surprised if the shift we're seeing and the shift we see over the next few years to essentially nuclear becoming a much more friendly topic, to there being a deprogramming of the public.
But this comes back to the discussion we had in terms of media narratives, because the idea that these things were fundamentally unsafe and needed to be shut down came from the media. And I cannot tell you how angry I was with myself when I discovered that 3 Mile Island was running up until 2019.
Yeah.
And more importantly, that Chernobyl has been producing
electricity. And
electricity.
how many times in your life have you probably cited, there was that nuclear disaster in
Exactly.
the US at 3 Mile Island, because that's what was parroted.
Yes.
And it's just...
And if you consider what the human race has lost over the past 50 years.
From not just having free, reliable energy, close to free, reliable energy.
That's what nuclear is. There could have been nuclear plants built around this entire continent, which would have just yanked people out of poverty. The overall impact then in terms of food security, in terms of education, telecommunications, all of the stuff that goes with it that's dependent upon clean, reliable energy. So we are at the stage now where we need to be calling out people like Alan Winde at every conceivable opportunity, because people who are embarking on a deliberate path to keep people in abject poverty need to be called out, because that is the true evil in the world. Let's be very clear about it. In any policy that you want to put in place that is at the end of the day going to keep people in abject poverty, which is the reason why you and I hate communism as much as we do.
Yes.
Because
that's a throttle on prosperity.
That's the fundamental evil of it.
It prevents prosperity.
It prevents prosperity, yes,
Absolutely.
and reduces everyone to the same level of poverty, except for the political overlords, of course. So I'm very clear that we need to be targeting people who are pushing this just energy transition rubbish,
Yes.
because at the point at which we're able to provide reliable energy across the board to our people, that's the path to prosperity.
Absolutely. I mean, I couldn't agree more. I was just looking for something, because nuclear, there's so much. So it's one of my sort of pet, I can't say projects, but subjects that I really have spent a lot of time on is nuclear and nuclear energy. And essentially everything people believe. And when I say people, I mean the general public. If you go into general polite society, as I do on occasion, not too often because small doses of me and them. But if you go into polite society and you say to people, what do you think about nuclear energy? The narrative is very clear. So firstly, the first thing people think when you say nuclear is nuclear weapons, and they specifically think about Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and the risk of nuclear explosions. And they cannot separate themselves from what that looks like versus nuclear energy. So they've already got a negative view of the word nuclear. Then when you talk about nuclear energy, the next thing that comes to their mind is usually something like Chernobyl. And that's usually the one that most comes to mind. But when you ask people, how many people actually died at Chernobyl, the numbers people think and the numbers that actually died are very, very far from each other. Top of my head, as far as I remember, the WHO, which it wants to make nuclear look bad, isn't there advocating for nuclear. The WHO under the UN said that 1,100 people died as a result of what occurred in Chernobyl in total. So both on the day, remember there was an actual explosion and a structural collapse. So several people, I think it was 70, died on the day, and total 1,100 people from Chernobyl. Now, you may say, well, 1,100 is a lot of people to die. And I'll say to you, well, how many people do you think die every year in the operations that lead us to get energy from coal or energy from gas or energy from even renewables? You think nobody dies setting up wind turbines, cleaning wind turbines using helicopters, these types of things. So the reality is that industry, unfortunately, results in death. If you take the nuclear industry over the period that it's operated, which is since about 1950, 54, I think, the first nuclear power station. If you take that over the entire period to date, the nuclear energy sector is actually one of the safest industries in the entire world. And then, of course, people, once you get over that point and you say, and you talk about new generations of energy, because you today would not be allowed to, but also would not want to build a power station like Chernobyl. So if you built a power station today, it'd be a new generation power station, nuclear power station. And so what happened at Chernobyl cannot happen because we learned lessons, okay? And in fact, pebble bed reactors, for example, can't melt down because that's their entire design, is that can't occur. In fact, when they start to get a runaway reaction, they actually shut down rather than melt down.
Exactly. And also we've got, newer technologies like sodium-cooled reactors,
Yes.
helium-cooled reactors.
Absolutely.
Both of which prevent a situation where a Fukushima-type scenario
could happen.
would happen.
So,
yeah.
and Fukushima, as it happens, nobody died directly from that. The deaths, there were some deaths related to traffic accidents, people panicking. There's one guy who said he got thyroid cancer who's busy in a lawsuit with the Japanese government, but it's really the current Fukushima caused death is 0. And, from nuclear fallout or whatever like that. And then once you get over all of that, they'll say, but the waste, Kanthan, the waste is the problem. You have this radioactive waste, you can't do anything with it, which is not even true in and of itself because you now have thorium reactors, and thorium reactors can reuse some of the waste for up to 1,200 years or something like that. Okay, this is all sort of, some of it's hypothetical technology in the sense that it hasn't actually been tried outside of the lab. But there are solutions constantly being developed to these problems. But even if you had the waste problem, and it does produce waste.
Well, let me tell you my solution to the nuclear waste problem.
Let me just tell you how much waste there is. Let me tell you how much waste there exists on the entire Earth. From all of the nuclear operations, and France runs more than 60% of
probably
its
smaller
energy
than a soccer field.
It is a soccer field, or a football field,
Yes.
as the Americans would call it. You can fit all of the waste in the entire world from nuclear, from all of the energy, and many countries run a lot of their grid on nuclear, like France, for example. America used to run up to 40% of its grid. It's a little bit less now. The entire thing could fit on a football field. And in fact, the American waste could fit onto one basketball field. So you don't want reliable, cheap energy.
So let me tell you my solution to getting rid of the nuclear waste.
Yeah.
Because if you continue on the current path that Elon Musk has in terms of the cost per kilogram of launching things into space.
Yes, I know
You just shoot the stuff into the sun.
Yes,
Piece of cake.
The biggest problem has always been with any kind of taking any waste. I mean, this would be a good argument for all of our other waste, right?
No, it isn't. You see, it is something in the case of nuclear waste because it is small enough and contained enough, and pretty much all you have to do once you've got it into space is to launch it in the direction of the sun, and then it'll take the next, maybe 100 years to get there.
The problem here, which people have pointed out, which I acknowledge, I think this is a fair argument, is that 1 in 100 rockets that goes up to space is going to explode. Okay? And so what we don't want is we put a few kilograms of nuclear waste, which would actually be several years of energy. But we put a few kilograms of nuclear waste onto a rocket, it explodes on the way up, and then you pollute the atmosphere with a whole bunch of radioactive waste. So that's the argument against it. And as I said, I think even for normal trash, you could make an argument if it became cheap enough, right, to stick it onto rockets and just launch it at the sun perpetually. Build some sort of very technological slingshot.
So carbon fiber space elevators.
Yes, I like this.
Yeah,
I like this a lot.
Is the technology, but
yeah.
Yeah, and look, the theoretical framework is already in place. All that's needed is sufficient industrial production capacity in order to be able to build it. But, we are too busy sending money to fund forever wars in various parts of the world to actually focus on
fighting with each other over bullshit. Absolutely. Oh, that was a nice sort of turn into nuclear. I really do love that subject. Is there anything else you wanted to get to?
No, I don't. I don't think so at this particular point. I'm not going to be carrying a pager anytime soon.
We're not giving the people their money's worth, Kanthan. We're not. This is a short podcast for us.
Look, in terms of the stuff that's been happening over the past couple of weeks, so the reason why I wanted to finish on the nuclear point is because I wanted to make the case that it's not all doom and gloom. And the fact that the narrative has now been tilting in the direction of nuclear means that the conversation now shifts, and it no longer becomes a question of should we be going nuclear or not. It now becomes a question of what is the most efficient way for us to be going nuclear.
That. Absolutely.
But more to the point, now that you've opened the door in terms of private companies effectively being able to take control of the nuclear space.
And how do we reduce the cost? Because this is the one good argument against nuclear. If you go look at cost of nuclear, for example, against coal, it makes more sense to build coal, just on cost. But the reason that cost exists, you can go Google it, you'll see. But the reason that cost exists is regulatory in nature. So it takes about 10 years to build a nuclear power station. Now, it doesn't actually take 10 years. But what's causing that delay is a whole bunch of regulations that prevent you from moving from step to step until you've had inspectors from the International Energy Agency. You have to have approvals from various agencies, all of which slow everything down and make everything a costly process. The actual technology in and of itself is not particularly expensive in comparison to other energy. However, in terms of what the roadblocks we've put in the way to build the technology, that can be quite costly. What have you found?
So the thing that I wanted to check,
Yes.
okay, which was something that I had not paid attention to. I had paid attention to it at the time, but I said to myself that it's actually quite inexpensive. And this was the El Dabaa nuclear power plant in Egypt, which, of course, is a series of 4 reactors that is being built by the Russians. And the price tag on that is 28 billion US.
Yeah.
Okay, which is effectively going to guarantee the energy security of
Egypt for the next century.
At minimum of
60
the next
years.
Yeah, 60 years.
Yeah.
So now, what did we pay for Medupi and Kusile?
I think what are we at this point? We must have spent about 30 billion on the two of them. Somewhere in the
No, it's much more than that at this point. Really?
We'll check it. I'm not 100% sure, but as far as I recall, it was in that ballpark. It might have been more. I stopped sort of caring.
Medupi was 145 billion, or 9.7 billion US.
Yes.
Okay, so effectively, what you're looking at in terms of an El Dabaa type scenario is somewhere around 3 times the amount of money that we've spent to date on Medupi. So what I'm saying is that the cost benefit analysis that one has to apply in terms of nuclear, right now, it actually makes a lot more sense to build new nuclear than to build new coal. And the reason why, because you're getting more bang for buck.
Yeah, you get more bang for absolutely more bang for buck, less environmental concern. So, if you can accept that your novel nuclear stuff is not going to melt down, if you understand that is true, and you also understand that the waste is really not a big deal, and you're willing to accept that, then what you have is you essentially have something which produces the greenest possible energy on the planet. So if you're truly an environmentalist, nuclear is the way you want to go. If Greta Thunberg was a useful human being, she would be advocating for nuclear energy. And in fact, whoever ends up doing that and really pushes the world towards nuclear energy will be a hero. That person will go down somewhere in the history books as having really done justice to humanity, because the chances are, I know people are waiting for fusion to occur at some point, and maybe it will. But you know, at the moment, the best technology we have and have had for 70 years. We've had it in our hands for 70 years, and we maligned it, and we sort of made everyone scared of it. And so we've used other technologies which have been somewhat environmentally damaging. Certainly, it's better to use nuclear than coal or gas, although those technologies have also become cleaner. But you know, it just doesn't make sense that we carry on down this road. And you know, given that we've got, it just worries me from a South African perspective. We've got government officials sitting at climate conferences and pushing just energy transitions, and there seems to be no vision and no knowledge of any of this stuff, and no challenge. And I suppose if you know, you got a red pill on that, and you are, you know, you read around stuff,
yes,
and you spend your time
I've
dissecting topics.
Look, I've been a fan of nuclear for the longest times, but
yes,
but the false narrative around
even the disasters
is the part that I was red pilled about.
Yeah. So I think, you know, that's a good heuristic, perhaps, for listeners, viewers of the show, for anyone really. But I assume we haven't caught the entire society just yet. The good heuristic is this: if, for example, the media, as they did a few years back when we were considering nuclear, if the media is only telling you how terrible this is, and you can only find information on how bad something is, you should probably question that narrative, because that's almost never the case for almost anything in life. It's not, you know, it's the Thomas Sowell quote, which is, there are no solutions, there are only trade-offs. So for everything that you find as a solution, there's going to be some sort of sacrifice somewhere along the way. There's going to be things you give up or bad things that occur as externalities, or for bad things there might be good externalities. You know, that's just how life is. And so if the narrative you're being sold is one of, well, you know, if we do this, it's all bad, it's all the way down, you should probably be questioning that. You should probably be saying, is that really the case? Surely there must be there's got to be a good side to this. Otherwise, it wouldn't exist. There wouldn't be some people going for it. What's the good side?
So I'm very clearly now in the camp where if News 24 says it's a good thing, I know it's bad. If the Daily Maverick says it's a good thing, I know it's bad.
Yeah,
and,
or vice versa.
And let's use it as, it doesn't necessarily mean that vice versa.
Sometimes bad things are bad things.
Sometimes bad things are bad things, exactly. And, you know, so there's no way that you can ever convince me that the mustache man was in any way good for humanity.
Yes.
And, you know, so I think, you know, we can be very clear about that. So, you know, if News 24 happens to be agreeing with that narrative, well, good for you, because it would really be a point of absurdity if you were pushing any other discussion.
And perhaps to come full circle on that, I'll just say that Mustache Man, his goal was to create division and then kill off the people on the other side of the divide. And I don't see what the purpose of our media pushing race baiting, for example, is, but to create division and then cause some sort of negative thing to occur to those people on the other side of the divide. And so, you know, if you're doing that, someone said this week it was Heritage Day, which doesn't really, it's another quasi-socialist holiday. But if you want to celebrate it and you want to celebrate the fact that there's different cultures in the country, that's great. I'm more than happy with that. But someone mentioned that, you know, they felt that this year there wasn't much sort of celebration of Heritage Day. And I thought to myself, I wonder if that's got anything to do with the fact that we spend 364 days of the year dividing each other as much as we possibly can, picking out the differences in a negative way. And then one day a year we go, hey guys, diversity is our strength. We should be unified. I just wonder if you know, if we could just stop doing stupid things like that.
I'm still going to continue calling it National Braai Day, because I'm of the view that there is nothing that unites us as a nation as much as our desire to light a fire
and cook meat on
it. You know, and this cuts across the board.
It does. It really does.
Yes. So
really does.
You know,
I think that's
guys,
why that resonated originally, is because every single culture does that.
Yeah. So by all means dress up, you know, by all means celebrate whatever your view is on your particular culture. And hey, that's great. You know,
absolutely.
I'm very happy for you to do that. But if you want the unifying factor, guys, it's going to be that meat on the coals. And yeah, what are you doing for lunch, by the way?
We can chat about it. Now that you made us all hungry. As always, it's been a pleasure. Let's call this one here. We'll try to do the next one a little bit earlier. This one we a little bit later than we wanted for studio time reasons. Thank you so much for listening and watching. If you do like the show, please like it, subscribe, share, and comment if you like. We got some good comments last time, some constructive feedback as well. Do like being fact checked if you need to. If you want to do an ABC News moment on Kanthan or myself, and you want to just fact check us on a particular topic, we do try to get it as right as possible, but we are sitting here talking off the top of our heads for the most part.
And more to the point is that we are never ashamed to say that we got it wrong.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. If we got it wrong, hopefully not in a very meaningful way. It's like usually little details, but thanks so much for those of you who do come in with those constructive elements. And we will catch you next time. Thanks so much.
Cheers.